Okay, I want to talk to you about the risk assessment process first. And I'm using the graphic from that ISO 31000 standard, the one that Kevin and myself were involved in developing, and many others from about 25 countries. And what you'll see here is that risk assessment is actually three steps. You've got to identify the risks first, and then you've got to analyze them, and then make a decision as to, well, which ones can you accept and which ones do you need to treat and do something about. People sometimes think the analysis bit is the assessment, but an assessment is, as you can see, a more complex process. So I want to talk about when you decide to do risk assessment, you might start first with identify the risks, and that is important, that you're focused on, okay, the technique you use, first you want to identify the risks. What are the risks, and create a list. You then move on to analysis, to understand exactly what's in place, what controls are in place, are they working, do we need more? The evaluation is, is the level of control and mitigation acceptable? Can we accept the residual risk that exists? And there are different techniques for each of these that are, let's say, better at the different phases of the risk assessment. One I'm going to show you is a fault tree analysis, and it's about establishing sources, looking back further than the risk, not just identifying it, but what are the sources? Why could this happen? This unacceptable or undesirable circumstances that you want to avoid. And then there's, when you've decided, okay, we need to improve the mitigation of this risk, you might have several options. It could be financial one that is very expensive but very effective, or a less expensive one that does the job good enough. There's lots of different things that you might compare. And if it's a health and safety one, then you might have to go for the more expensive option if you're trying to bring the risk as low as reasonably practical. Okay. I'm going to show you 9 groups of techniques, and purely to let you know that no matter what the risk is that you're trying to assess, there's probably a technique out there for you. Now, the most common technique for, I suppose, identifying risks is the brainstorming technique, where you sit around a table, blank sheet of paper, and everybody puts the risks on the table that they know. The nominal group technique is similar, but it's to cope with maybe a dominant individual that you might have at a brainstorming meeting. So allow people to do the brainstorming privately first and submit them to the meeting. So you start the meeting with everybody's ideas. I'm not going to go through all of these, just giving you a flavor. Identification techniques that maybe might be from the top down, whereas the first set here was bottom up. Might be checklists or classifications or taxonomy. So you start with the taxonomy. I'm going to look for political risks, economic, social, technological, environmental, people, supply chain, and you pick categories and drill down and see what risks are in there. It's a top-down approach. I'm going to probably I'll focus on the fault tree. This is the one looking for the source. So you've identified the risk, but what could cause that? I'm going to look at a fault tree analysis later, but there are several techniques in each of these areas. So now you've identified the risk, you've identified the sources. Now you want to analyze the controls that are in place. Do you have a policy? Do you have procedures? Have you trained the people? And there are a few techniques there. My favorite is the bow tie analysis. And indeed, it's a useful one for explaining a lot of principles of risk management. So now you understand the controls. Now you need to understand the consequences of the risk. So and an event is not a risk. So if you have a service disruption, and you might say service disruption as a shorthand for a very big risk, but what consequences are you thinking? And you might have several service disruption type risks. So the consequences might be your tenants can't pay their rent. It could be that the tenants that you can't communicate with the tenants for whatever, however you might have been communicating with them. There are different consequences that you need to think about, and think about what the impact is for you as well as your tenants. I'm sure you're always considering that. If you have time, and this is not one that too many do, but if you need to understand the cross-impact analysis that different risks have in different areas, to my mind, it's a lot of time. And personally, I'm not sure whether the effort is worth it. But in large, complex organizations, you will want maybe to do that. And then the techniques for comparing options, because there are many ways to mitigate a risk. And it might be a cost-benefit approach you take, or it might be that you're looking for what will reduce the likelihood the most. And then, how do you evaluate the significance of risk? Now, since 1648, the most common way of measuring it is consequence and likelihood. Consequence multiplied by likelihood. There are other techniques. But today isn't about the different techniques, but that's how you measure it. If you use a 5x5 scale, then the maximum risk is 25, for example. And finally, how do you report on risks? And again, the most common one here is a risk register. You'd be familiar with. But I'm showing you the screen just so you know that should you have a very difficult risk you're trying to mitigate, there are other techniques out there. Okay, now you can see I've highlighted two. I'm going to talk about the fault tree analysis as an identification and determining the sources of risk. And then we look at business impact analysis, because today we're talking about service disruption. So if you've identified the risk as a service disruption, not too difficult, you want to look now to the left, what could cause that service disruption? What are the sources of this? And this mind map that I'm showing you is actually the result of a workshop we did with 3 customers around the table. And it was quite useful, because you'll see in a moment that there are many things that can lead to a service disruption. It could be a system failure. For whatever reason, we'll look in a moment, and let's face it, most of our processes at work today are dependent on some piece of technology. There's hardly any functions we can conduct without a computer of some sort. It could be that you've lost the building. Now, it could be a fire, a flood. It could be a fire next door. But for some reason, you can't get into your building. It could be a loss of people, a pandemic. It could be a local epidemic, or it could be a strike. It could be people leaving for better paid jobs and you can't recruit. So there are lots of things that might cause a service disruption on people. Financial, maybe the financial people got their sums wrong and you're now struggling to pay your obligations. It could be a disruption at a third party. And this is one we often forget. If you're dependent on a third party, they are an extension of your organization, and any disruption at that organization is a disruption for you. And finally, maybe the regulator decides to shut you down for a few days while they investigate. That could be a severe one as well. Now, when you've identified the primary, I would say, the primary causes for the service disruption, go back further. What could cause a system failure? Computers fail if they lose power, right? If you don't have a backup power system. So let's have a look. I'll put in the detail here. It could be a loss of air conditioning. It could be loss of gas. We are now so dependent on the internet. What happens if you lose your internet connection? If you only have the one? If you lose your telephony, your voice connection? I'm a former hardware engineer, and I can tell you, yes, hardware does fail. Eventually, it will fail. So lots of things that can cause a system failure, but we tend to focus on cyber attack. And I put that in here just to show you it's only one of maybe 20 things that could cause a service disruption. And if we're talking about risk mitigation, you need to understand, I suppose, where this can all come from, because there's lots of more detailed risks in here. You could take 6 risks out of here, like system failure as a risk, and what do we need to do to mitigate that? And maybe have a battery backup on your server, and maybe have a generator, etc. Maybe have, dual power supplies, and lots of things you can do that the IT guys will know about. A building loss, and it could be a fire, flood, or a severe weather event. And I think when I was talking to Steve about this one, he said you should put in extreme heat in here as well, not just extreme cold. And certainly we are experiencing higher temperatures than ever. People, again, sickness, but it could also be the strike, it could be increased workload, absence of work, financial. You see where I'm going with this. Now, I don't need to read everything out here. I want to give you a flavor for, sit down and try and understand where this can come from. There are things you can do in all of these. If you take the third party, you should be assessing how good is their business continuity plan. You might have a great plan, but if they have a disaster, how well prepared are they? So I certainly would be taking a look at their plan. Okay. I want to talk about business impact analysis technique. This is a well-known technique, and it's really to understand, well, if we take a service disruption, how could this affect the organization's operations? What if, the systems were down? What functions, what processes are affected? It's useful for identifying, I suppose, critical functions and the dependencies on those, because maybe you need the internet and a server to be up and running to be able to deliver a particular process. It'll certainly give you an understanding as to your capability for managing a disruptive incident, because it'll raise all sorts of questions. It's usually conducted, and Steve will tell you more about this, I'm sure, with questionnaires, interviews, workshops. And certainly when I've done it, I've sat with the people responsible for the individual processes and functions and asked them, what if you couldn't deliver the service? What is the impact? In summary, I would say it's used to determine the criticality and recovery timeframe. So one of the questions you might ask is, well, how long can you afford as an organization not to be delivering this service, whatever it is? The answer might be 1 hour, it might be 1 day, it might be 1 week, but your answer will determine the recovery strategy, then certainly the business continuity strategy that is, or strategies that are available to you. Certainly if the time is short and you need to recover quickly, you've got fewer options, I think, for recovery. Again, something that Steve will drill down on. And finally, my final slide is, again, an introduction, I guess, to the beginning of the business continuity plan. Document all your processes. And I found a useful way to start this is, if you have a standard operating procedures handbook, you'll find a lot of them listed in there, but create a list of the processes and who is the owner of those processes, responsible to make sure it happens, and then conduct an interview with them, understand the process, and particularly the dependencies. And there might be people dependencies. It might be dependent on an individual to run the process, which is something you should be aware of. There might be a dependency on a system and maybe also the internet. You need to understand that, because if you have a disruption, you need to know in which order do we restore the systems. If you think about it, if you have 10 systems, it could take the IT guys 2 hours to bring up each system. So you need to know, well, which are the first 3 that I'm going to bring up. And I'll say it again, if you're dependent on a third party and they go down or some part of the process is affected, you need to have tested those business continuity plans with that third party. I call it MTO. I think Steve calls it MTPD, maximum tolerable outage, or maximum tolerable period of disruption. This is a good measure. And this is the answer to the question is, how long can you afford not to be delivering this service in elapsed hours, maybe, or in business hours, but be clear which it is. And the recovery point objective, RPO, and I think Steve will go into this in more detail, is I describe it as how much data can you afford to lose? If you have a disruption today at 5 o'clock, is it okay to go back to 5 o'clock yesterday? So 24 hours, or last night's backup, which means you have to re-key in all the information you put into systems today. And again, the recovery point objective will determine your recovery strategies, or certainly what ones are available to you. So I'm going to pass over to Steve now, and he's going to take it from here. You've done your initial business impact analysis, and he's going to build on that. Steve. You need to unmute, I think.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Perfect.
I can hear you perfectly.
Yeah, I seem to have lost video as well. Okay, as long as you can hear me okay. Okay, just in terms of the business impact analysis, as Jerry has mentioned, really, business impact analysis follows on once you've identified your risks. Then the next thing you need to be worrying about is, or thinking about, is putting together this business impact analysis. The business impact analysis is basically the foundation for the business continuity plan. It's all about information gathering to identify what you need to be considering for business continuity. It helps you as part of this is identifying your business critical activities, and certainly for housing associations that may well be like I said, a contact center. It might be emergency repairs, it might even be sort of payroll, but payroll is only critical at certain times of the month. If you only pay payroll once a month, then once you've paid payroll it becomes less critical, but it will become critical again at a certain time. Clarifying the maximum tolerable period disruption and a recovery time objective and a recovery point objective, as Jerry's already covered to some degree, but I'll come on to that again in a few minutes. And then considering the impacts from a disruption, what are the impacts on the organisation if you are affected by an incident? The first thing you need to be considering is the people aspects of it. What is the impact on your customers if you can't deliver that service? And we've seen with some housing associations last year that they were struggling to provide their services for several weeks following a cyber incident. So looking at what is the impact on your customers, what's the impact on staff as well? If you can't deliver services, surely there's some impact on staff, but also on potentially on members of the public as well. Financial impacts, those financial impacts are, it could well be that it's a fine from the regulator or fine from the ICO if you've suffered a cyber breach and your procedures have not been that good in the first place. But looking at those financial, if people can't pay their rent for whatever reason, what again, there is going to be an impact on the organisation. Reputational, certainly if you are affected by an incident, then reputation becomes quite key in this, and how you respond as an organisation from a cyber incident or an incident where it affects your operations, then how you respond to that from a reputational impact can help save the organisation if you're quite proactive in terms of your response to an incident, rather than sort of like closing down your contact centre and not taking any calls, etc. It's going to have more of an impact. Contract, legal and regulatory requirements. So what are those in terms of the impacts on the organisation? If you can't deliver your services, is there a contractual requirements with your customers? Operational impacts. So what is the impact on operations if you can't deliver critical services and those emergency repairs and take calls, etc.? There is going to be an operational impact. So you're looking at the mitigation then from these types of incidents of responding to those. And then finally, the business objectives. So as an organisation, I'm sure you've got objectives and like things that you want to do over the next like year or 5 years, etc. So is that impact incident going to have an impact on those business objectives? And then consider your resource requirements. And again, I'll come on to the resource requirements as part of the business continuity in a few slides. Mentioned a few times about MTPD, RTO and RPO. If you have a look at the actual scenario here, if an incident happens, what is the maximum tolerable period of disruption? How long can you go as an organisation before not being able to recover your operations will have a detrimental impact on the organisation? And Once you identify that MTPD, you can then have a look at what is the recovery time objective. And that recovery time objective should be shorter than the MTPD, because what you don't want to do is leave recovery those critical operations till the MTPD, and you start to have an impact on the organisation. As Jerry mentioned about the recovery points objective, if you are hit by an incident, and let's say, for instance, it is a cyber incident, when did you take your last backup? When is your last clean backup? Because if your backups have been affected by the cyber incident as well, you're going to have to go further and further back in terms of your backups, and you could potentially lose quite a fair bit of data, depending on how far you then have to go back as an organisation. In terms of an incident, basically we see it as the timeline. We've got 3 different areas here. The first part is a look at incident response, and that might be evacuation of the building, notifying the emergency services, first aid for people, and escalation of the incident to the incident management team. So you're then invoking the incident management team, so they're going to be coming back online. And then the next thing is, quite quickly, is you need to consider business continuity. What are those critical activities that you as an organisation need to recover quite quickly? Some of the less critical ones you can leave a little bit longer, but the critical activities you need to get back up and running quite quickly. Certainly the likes of the contact centre, emergency repairs, because if people have incidents in their houses because you've not been able to deliver that emergency repair, then it, again, is going to have impacts on the organisation. And then we've got the third part. We've got this long-term recovery and resumption, and depending on the nature, scale, and location of the incident, it could take quite a long time to actually get your systems back up online. If you take, for instance, when they had the Buncefield fire, there was a number of organisations based in the outskirts of Buncefield, and when that happened, some of those organisations took 2 years to actually recover their systems and recover their operations back to normal. In terms of the business continuity plan, the first thing you need to consider really is what do you actually need in terms of the contents of your business continuity plan. What is fit for purpose for your type of organisation? I would suggest as an organisation you need to consider what is the purpose of the business continuity plan, why you're having that BCP in place really in the first place. It could be a regulatory requirement, it could be a contractual requirement, or that it makes good business sense to have business continuity in place. Identifying the scope and the objectives of the business continuity plan. How far wide ranging is it going to be in terms of your plan? Are you just going to concentrate on critical activities? Is it going to be the whole organisation? Is it going to include your partners and third parties? Identifying your critical activities, what are those critical activities, and including them in your business continuity plan, because if an incident does happen, you need to know quite quickly what are the critical activities that you need to get back up and running again, and what is the recovery time for those activities. In terms of incident management, invocation, escalation, so invocation being if something happens outside the building, you're looking at evacuating, so you're bringing people back into a place of safety. And then escalation of that incident to the incident management team. So making sure that the incident management team are called quite quickly. Because people are working in an agile way now, that incident management team might be meeting via Microsoft Teams or another video conferencing tool, but making sure that they're notified so that they can come back in terms of the response to the scenario itself. Next thing is crisis communications. I will come on to crisis comms a little bit further, but certainly you will need to consider crisis communications and how you, as an organisation, you're going to communicate with your customers and other stakeholders. What are you going to be telling them? How often are you going to tell them in terms of communications? Roles and responsibilities, certainly for the incident management team, they need to know what their role is. Otherwise, it's not worth having a plan, because picking up a plan and people don't know how to use that document and what their roles and responsibilities are is going to be quite bad for the organisation. Strategies for recovery in terms of how are you going to respond to various types of incidents that could potentially affect the organisation. And then the resource requirements. What are the resources that you require in terms of getting back up and running again? And then finally, within your business continuity plan, as this is an example, I would suggest that you've got several appendices in those documents, and that might be different parts of contact details, etc. In terms of your business continuity plan, you need to make sure that that business continuity interacts with any other documents that you may well have in place for incident response. The IT disaster recovery plan, do they dovetail in terms of each other? So if an IT incident happens, are the incident management team notified, and does business continuity get invoked as part of that incident response? Crisis comms, data breach procedures, and as an organisation, you may well have operational level business continuity plans as well. So bringing them into effect, certainly for those operational level departments that have actually been affected. In terms of strategies and recovery resources, I've mentioned a few times really. The first thing you need to consider is your people side of things. Who are the people that you need to be able to respond to an incident that happens? Certainly you've got your incident management team, but who are the key people within each of the departments that you're going to be reliant on to recover your operations if an incident happens? And that might be that you'll tend to find that you may well have potential single points of failure within the teams. So it might be somebody with a defensible knowledge that if they left the organisation or weren't available when an incident happens, you are going to find that you're going to struggle a little bit more. So identifying those potential single points of failure and putting in procedures to cover that. And it might be procedural manuals, it might be cross-training staff, etc., and bringing that back up and running again. Next thing you need to consider is your information and data. So where's the information stored? How is it accessed? Who's got access to it? What security measures are in place to protect that information and data? Buildings, work environments, certainly as housing associations, I've found that a lot of people work in agile now. They might do a couple of days in the office, a couple of days at home, but there is still some requirements for buildings and work environments. Your depots, for instance, you might have a particular depot where you keep all your machinery that you go out and you do repairs, etc. on. So again, making sure that that is available and procedures in place that if something happens to one of those key buildings, how are you going to respond as an organisation? Equipment consumables, that could be selected tools for your repair operatives, or it could be something as simple as the company seal that you need, that when you're doing regulatory returns, if you have to have the company stamp on that document, and the company stamp is in the building that's on fire, again, you need to consider what are those key pieces of equipment, consumables that you need, and again, how you will actually recover if you lost access to those. ICT systems, I think Jerry's already mentioned that we are quite reliant now on IT systems. Everything is pretty much electronic rather than paper-based documentation, and how we communicate, because people are working in an agile manner, is how we actually communicate if something happens to those ICT systems. Microsoft is quite resilient as an organization, but if that goes down, it's going to have a significant impact on organizations. So making sure that you've got procedures in place. Transport logistics, let's say, for instance, there was a fuel dispute, how are you going to go about doing your critical repairs or your urgent repairs in terms of looking after your customers, etc. How people are going to get back into work if necessary, if there's a transport infrastructure strike. So again, considering that. Certainly with agile working now, it makes it a lot less reliance, but there is still a requirement for transportation. Finance systems, it could be, let's say, for instance, your payroll. How are you going to pay payroll if your IT systems are down? Do you use a third party? Can you pay on last month's payroll? So considering those particular options really in terms of taking things forward. But also having company credit cards in place, or let's say, for instance, you've got an evacuation in your housing stock. the local authority under the Civil Contingencies Act have got a responsibility to temporarily rehouse displaced persons. But if it's a small number, or some of your customers may well have certain vulnerabilities, then you might have to look at putting them up in hotels. So having those credit cards in place, or having procedures in place where you can put people up into a hotel is quite important. Partners and supply chain, I think Jerry mentioned this a few times really. As part of the procurement process, you may well ask your partners and suppliers, do you have a business continuity plan? And it might just be a tick box exercise. Yeah, we've got one of them. But does anybody actually look at those and say, okay, how robust is your business continuity? How often is it reviewed and tested and updated? But looking at, as I say, looking at your suppliers and your partners, and possibly delving into a little bit more information about those particular organisations. In terms of crisis communications, mentioned it a few times. I don't think I've come across an incident really yet. There isn't an element of crisis communications, certainly for those bigger type incidents. But the first thing you need to consider is your internal communications. Have you got staff contact details? If your IT systems are down and people are working remotely, how are you going to communicate with staff? External communications. Obviously, as an organisation, you've probably got a website. Is that externally hosted? And can you put messages on you for your customers? Or can you use social media for notifying customers of particular incidents that may well have happened? Various methods of communication. To consider, the more methods of communication you've got in terms of an incident occurring, then the more likelihood is that that message will get out to those various stakeholders. PR and media response. I mean, certainly PR and media is quite key. There are some really good examples out there, such as Richard Branson, when he had the rail crash, and it was one of his trains that crashed. He was abroad on holiday at that point, and he flew straight back into the UK, straight to the area that the incident had happened, and he was straight in front of the cameras, and he was responding quite quickly in terms of that. I think it was Bromford, when they had their cyber attack, their chief executive was doing a video the following day and saying, this is the state of play, this is where we're up to, etc. So again, making sure that those PR and media responses are really good, and that can help protect you as an organisation reputationally. Social media can have good aspects and really bad aspects. When they had the plane crash on the Hudson River in the US, that was on social media as video footage before air traffic control knew that it actually crashed on the Hudson. So again, it can be really good. Everybody's walking around with cameras now on their mobile phones, so they only have to pick you up saying something wrong, and it can have reputational impacts on the organisation. So you do need to consider your social media. Do you have a social media policy in place within the organisation that tells your staff, don't be posting anything on social media following an incident? Having trained spokespersons, really key. I mentioned Richard Branson a few minutes ago, but doing periodic testing or exercising with your spokespersons and making sure that they're trained. But also as part of that really is having prepared statements in place rather than being caught on the hoof really by the media people. In terms of the plan itself, I mentioned a few earlier on that plan appendices, and as an example, certainly some of the things that you might have within your business continuity plan is contact details for the incident management team and the deputies, and it's quite key that you have the deputies in there as well, because if your primary incident management team members are away on holiday or on leave somewhere, then you need to be actually contacting the successors or those deputies and getting them to cover the role. Other internal contact details, if you're working from home and you need to contact somebody and your IT systems are down, then having the contact details in that plan that might be hosted on SharePoint or somewhere as a secure location that you can access those details. External contact details, suppliers, regulators, insurers, it's quite wide ranging in terms of your external contact details that you might need to have in your business continuity plan. But reviewing the contact details, both internal and external, you might need to do that on a more regular basis, because the contact details are the things that are likely to go out of date within your plan. Recovery strategies for various incidents. It could be fire, flood and pestilence. What are the impacts on the organisation, and how you're going to actually recover to those particular scenarios. Possibly have an incident management team agenda in there, so that they follow a set format which supports that coordinated response to an incident. Template incident log. I would certainly say you need to keep an incident log if it's something where it goes to litigation in a couple of years' time, following it's like a major incident. You having a record of the actions that you took and the decisions that you made at that time, and why you possibly made those decisions, can help protect the organisation in the court of law, but also reputationally as well. Post-incident near miss debrief template. So if you do have an incident or a near miss, looking at that incident, what happened, why did it happen, how did we respond as an organisation, what resources didn't we have and we thought we would have had available, etc. So looking at that incident and deciding how your response occurred and what can we do differently and better in the future. And then possibly your template crisis comms messages, and having them for various types of incidents that might occur. In terms of your business continuity plan, it does need to be trained out to people, and it needs to be trained out quite regularly. And I would certainly say on an annual basis for training out, but not only for your incident management team, but also your IMT deputies and successors, making sure that they're aware of the plan. A couple of occasions I've called exercises, and people have been come into exercise or into incidents, and they've not known that their name was actually in the business continuity plan as a member of the incident management team. So it's important really that they are trained out to them, but also having an agenda in there for different types of the responsibilities. So knowing about the business continuity plan, where is it held, can they access it, what their roles and responsibilities are, etc. And when to invoke business continuity. And it's not always quite clear. It's there's a bit of a grey area whether you invoke or don't invoke. And in some circumstances, we put within the business continuity plans that we do about having maybe a buffer time and just monitoring a situation. If it gets worse, then you invoke. Once you've done your training, certainly I would suggest that you do some exercise and a testing of that plan, really. What you're not trying to do is test the actual incident management team. You're trying to test the plan. Is it fit for purpose? Is there anything that needs to be changed in that document to make it better, so that if an incident does happen, that you respond in a more proactive way? Testing needs to be done, as I would certainly suggest, annually, and that includes both the incident management team and the deputies and the successors. But also, once you got to a certain point and you're quite happy with your plan and you're happy with your response, there's no reason why you can't start pulling in different external partners, suppliers, local authority, emergency services. And we've done that as part of the exercise that I've done on previous occasions, where we've brought them in because there's a certain expectation. Let's say, for instance, it's an evacuation of properties. And local authorities might well have that responsibility to look after evacuated people. Them actually clarifying what they would and wouldn't provide as part of that response can help you understand really what their roles and responsibilities are. Various types of exercises that you can do. The first one might be like a plan walkthrough, where as an incident management team, you sit down around the table and you go through the plan page by page. Quite onerous by doing that, and it doesn't always achieve what you wanted to do, but certainly it makes sure that the plan is up to date. The next one, which is the more popular one really, is desktop exercise, and doing that on an annual basis so that people understand their roles and responsibilities, so that when an incident does happen, the more times that they're trained and exercised in using that plan, the better the response will be to different types of scenario. And then you've got semi-live or live type exercises. But when you're running an exercise or a test, what you don't want to do is for that exercise or test to have an impact on general day-to-day activities. So you need to be mindful of that when you are running your exercise session. Confucius was thought to have said, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, and I do and understand. So actually getting incident management team members involved in that exercise session, the more times they do that, they will understand, and the business continuity plan will become embedded into those people, so they will respond a lot better in terms of the response. In terms of plan maintenance, certainly we would suggest that the frequency needs to be done at least annually, maybe a bit more regular in terms of the contact details in those plans, just to make sure that when you pull that plan off the shelf, that it is fit for purpose and ready for use. In terms of responsibility for business continuity, certainly I would say that you need to appoint a lead for the business continuity, but getting that executive sign-off from not only the executive, but potentially also the audit and risk committee, and making sure that they're aware of where business continuity is up to in the organisation, because it is within the board members' handbook that they have a partial responsibility for business continuity as well. Contributors, certainly the service leads, they know their services best, so getting their input into looking after that plan and updating that document. Potential specialists, it might be the IT, it might be data protection officer, it might be somebody from facilities, so getting their input into the plan itself. Partners and suppliers, and making sure that their details are up to date. And then if you are affected by an incident or an EMS, you do need to carry out this review, and I did mention this earlier on, but carrying that out at the earliest opportunity. I'm not saying that if you have an incident today, you need to do the debrief tomorrow, but possibly early next week, really, while it's still fresh in people's minds. Leave it too long and people start to forget about what the action they took or what decisions that they made. Invite inputs from all the relevant parties, and that might be the local authority, it might be some of your key suppliers, but also key members of staff within your organisation. Consider what well in terms of the response, or how well did you respond as an organisation. And you're always going to find that people go the extra mile to some degree, but you're also going to find the things that don't necessarily go so well. So it's identifying those, and it's not a finger pointing exercise, it's identifying what didn't work so well, so that you can make changes that if a similar incident happens in the future, then you respond better as an organisation, or people respond better in terms of what they do. And then what changes need to be made in the future to continually improve that business continuity management system that you've got in place. Produce a post-incident debrief report or a near-miss report, updating the business continuity documents. And I say documents rather than business continuity plan, because you do need to consider, do we need to go back as an organisation and look at the BIA, the business impact analysis? Have things changed, or our critical activities changed? So going back to those documents afterwards and saying, okay, what worked well and what do we need to change? Arrange further training if required. If people have not responded as well as what you would expect at an incident, it might be a training issue. If it's a cyber incident and somebody's been affected by a phishing attack, again, it goes back to potentially a training issue. And then produce that report to the board or the regulators and the audit risk committee, all the relevant parties, just so that they know what happened, why it happened, what your response would be, what action that you've taken to reduce the likelihood of something happening again, or if it does happen, improve your response to those incidents again going forward in the future. And that's it from me. I think I'll bring Jared back in again if we've got any questions from people.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Jerry, for that great presentation. Really enjoyed it. And we actually have 2 questions in the Q&A box, so if we want to tackle those. So firstly, we were asked, who should take responsibility for business continuity in the organisation?
Leave that to Steve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I did cover that to some degree. Certainly as business continuity, you do need to make sure that you've got that project lead and possibly a deputy project lead for business continuity, because if the lead is off on holiday, somebody else needs to pick up that role, or if somebody leaves the organization again, that knowledge needs to be shared rather than having potential single points of failure within the organization. But at an executive level, then there should be some sort of executive sign-off for those business continuity documents. And I did cover that to some degree within my presentation, that you need to have that sign-off. And it might be that you've got a business continuity policy in place that says why we do business continuity, who's responsible for it, how often it will be reviewed, tested, updated, that sort of thing. So having that and having that policy agreed by the executive team. And then also that I mentioned about the board input, because as part of the board responsibilities, they've got business continuity or oversight of business continuity. Hopefully that covers it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. We have another one from Rola. Thank you. That's a great question. If an incident has taken place, could this be treated as a test and learn from its lessons?
Well, I think both of us will say, Steve, absolutely yes. You learn from every incident, whether it's an exercise or a real incident. Yeah,
certainly. I mean, we tend to, when we're doing exercises, certainly with my clients, is that each time I do an exercise, I do a different scenario, so that we're testing various aspects of the plan, but also exercising the roles and responsibilities for different people within the organization. If you are affected by an incident, it's quite different from running an exercise. There's more pressure on people. But the more, as I say, you're trained and exercised within that plan, then if an incident does happen, you will find that you will respond a lot better as an organisation.
Excellent. Okay, perfect. And there's one more in the Q&A so far. If anyone has any questions they'd like to throw in, please feel free to do so. Our last question at the moment is, how often should one update the organisation's risk register?
The short answer to that is whenever there's a change in the context, in the environment. I mean, people think a risk assessment is a once a year activity. Well, yes, you should probably assess them all at least once a year, but if things change, if the government changed the rules on financing, if they change the rules on your obligations, that should be a trigger to you to say, we need to reassess, review and reassess maybe half a dozen risks. So if you are managing risk in an active way, you will know on a weekly, monthly basis, there are certain things you need to review and update. If you're horizon scanning, as they say, or alert to emerging risks, you're gathering the risk intelligence, seeing what's happening, other housing associations, and you're just aware of what's happening, you will get prompts and triggers to review and update certain risks. It's not a daily, weekly, monthly, annual. I would like to think that all risks are reviewed at least once a year, but when things happen, that's your trigger. Hopefully that's clear enough.
I think the other thing that you need to add in there is potential horizon scanning. As an organisation, the Business Continuity Institute do a lot of horizon scanning, so they look at what's the potential risks, and there is like a UK risk register, national risk register, but there's also risk registers more locally. So looking at those risk registers and the potential impacts that could affect the organisation. If you've got a coma site, let's say, for instance, a chemical site, that if something happened there, then there is it's like an increased risk to your organisation if you are close to one of those chemical sites and something happens. So looking at the horizon scanning, I mean, when the pandemic broke, people could see it was happening over in China. It started to work its way into Europe and then into the UK. So looking at those potential risks that are not necessarily in your risk register, but do they then need to be in your risk register going forward?
Excellent. Okay, that was very informative. And we have one more. I think we have time for one more, and this is from Chris. He says, when writing a business continuity plan, how long should the organisation plan for an outage? Should we plan for a system loss for up to 2 weeks, 1 week, and longer?
I think I would consider what your critical activities are really, but generally we would look at the short and medium term when you're looking at your business continuity plan, because after the first week or after the first 2 weeks, maybe, you've got a lot more time to consider what is the impacts on the organization from a long-term incident. If it's an incident where it is likely to take you out for some considerable time, then obviously you need to put more detail in there of those long-term recovery strategies for your business continuity plan. But generally, we would concentrate on certainly on that first week, maybe 2 weeks in terms of recovery.
Perfect. Okay, thank you both for speaking today. Really enjoyed it, really informative. To reiterate, we will be sending out the slides and recording afterwards as well.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.